Well, I think in general, businesses do respect human rights, and when through our complaints processes, a company and its managers and executives realise that they have not met those standards, they're usually very keen to want to understand what the law requires and how they can make change that's more systemic within their organisation. So I think we get a very positive response, and we do in fact manage to conciliate about 65% of our complaints. So I think the attitude is one of wanting to comply, but there are undeniably some small to medium companies that don't always have the resources to get across the full legal ramifications of law. For example, the recently passed sexual orientation rules. That they're something that smaller businesses are going to have trouble perhaps grappling with understanding exactly what they are. Oh, well, that's a very interesting question. I think, of course, it's very nice for some companies to say, well, that's a problem for developing countries and poorer economies, and not something that applies in Australia. I don't actually think, I don't think companies really do say that. I think they know very well that core human rights principles apply in Australia, and I think they do know, of course, about race discrimination, sex discrimination, disability, age. They're aware that they exist, but they don't always understand quite what those principles that prohibit discrimination actually mean in the daily management of their businesses. Well, Australia is engaged in the UN processes and in the fora that are being set up through the United Nations. We have always been a good international citizen in developing these rules and engaged in the Ruggie process. As a country, many of the core human rights have been implemented in legislation with regard to race, age, sex, disability, but we still have a problem implementing the principles in domestic law because we've not passed appropriate implementing legislation. Well, I think it's very important because although one would argue that at base we do need a proper legislative base for human rights, there's no doubt that a very effective way of achieving human rights in practice is by engaging business in these voluntary undertakings. So that when you have a particular business saying, we understand and will commit to, for example, making our premises more accessible for those with disabilities, or we will ensure that we employ a reasonable number of disabled people. When you get a buy-in at that level, then you, even though it's voluntary, you get better outcomes than using formal legal processes and litigation or complaints processes. Well, of course, we would have always and continue to argue for the ability for women to have children, but also to retain their place within the employment community. It's been so damaging for women that they have not been able to continue to work because of commitments to children, and then we find that they don't have superannuation, they have pay gaps, they don't get the promotion, which explains why Australia has not been doing very well in relation to the gender gap in employment. So we see the opportunity of parental paid leave of a reasonable period of time as being a very significant advantage for women. Now, I also believe, based on the research, that once companies become aware and they see this policy actually playing out in practice, they will actually realise that it's a way of improving their businesses, because it means they don't lose all that expertise that they would otherwise have lost, and they keep loyal employees who will come back to them as women in the workforce and be a valuable asset to the company as a whole. So we think that in the longer term, companies will start to see the important benefits that these kinds of work practices will have in Australia. Well, we have taken on particular projects. It's not uncommon in relation to age and employment, disability, race. We've done a lot of work with the Australian Defence Forces in relation to sexual harassment, and I think partly building on the successful work we've done in these areas, the Attorney General's Department has agreed that we will take on this project. So it's going to be very important to get an objective research-based understanding of how women who are pregnant might be discriminated against in the workforce. So we don't know what the outcomes are going to be at the moment, although some very sad stories are starting to emerge at the early stages of this work. But we feel that this will provide a very interesting, objectively based research findings that will underlay future policy reform by the government. So it will be, we hope, very useful.